Welcome to Chautauqua People. My guest today is Professor Richard Heitsenrater of the Divinity School at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. He was born in New Jersey when his father was a student in Divinity School and moved to this area as his father was called to churches in Stockton, Little Valley, Westfield, and Jamestown. He attended public schools and was valedictorian of his graduating class at Jamestown High School. Richard received his undergraduate, divinity, and doctoral degrees from Duke University. He eventually returned to Duke following appointments at Center College of Kentucky and Southern Methodist University. He is currently the William Kellen Quick Professor Emeritus of Church History at the Divinity School. He's lectured widely in the United States, overseas in Britain, Switzerland, Japan, Korea, Singapore, Brazil, Sweden, Russia, Bulgaria, and Austria. He's published more than a dozen books and has received 3 honorary doctorates. He's on the staff of the archives at Chautauqua Institution and remains involved in the Academy and Church, and is a life member of the Wesley Historical Society and the World Methodist Historical Society. Professor Heitsenrater, how did your family make its way to Chautauqua County?
How did my family come to Chautauqua County? That's interesting, because my father and mother got married being the 2 teachers in a 2-room school in Pennsylvania. And my mother was the daughter of the minister at Valier. So he married them. My father first took a charge in Clymer, Pennsylvania. I think Clymer's in New York.
New York. Mm-hmm.
Clymer, New York. And interestingly enough, he got a raise the first year he was there from $1,100 to $1,200 a year, since the district superintendent said it would be easier to give him $100 a month. He decided he needed some seminary education because he had none. So that's why he went to Drew, and then he came back to this area, serving in Stockton, and I followed him around the places you mentioned.
Now, how did you choose to enter the ministry?
Well, my dad always said, if you can do something else, do it. So my sister was a nurse at WCA Hospital. She was in training there, and talked me into being a male nurse. Then I went from that to, maybe as I grew into high school, she was 5 years older than I was. I grew into high school, I decided I'd be a doctor, and then I went to seminary. I went to Duke University and had a course with a church history professor. And I thought, wow, I've never heard any of this history of Christianity in the church, which is a criticism of my father, which I shouldn't say, a blessed heart. But I really didn't realize that every congregation has in its midst members that believe various heresies from the past. And I thought, wow, this is what I want to do. I want to teach church history to ministers so that they will be able to let their people know what orthodoxy is, what heresy is, and what has happened in the history of the church, and what they believe in relation to the Bible and the doctrine of their church and Christianity in a historical sense. So I started out, even though my advisor thought I was a zoology major, being interested in church history, and have followed that ever since.
Now, can you give me a couple of those heresies that had widespread beliefs?
Well, Arianism would be an example, where people really believe that if you believe that Christ, Jesus is the Christ, and is not really God. He's more human than he is divine. So Christ as a human being is really Arianism. It's a delicate balance, the whole concept of the Trinity, because the opposite extreme is also a heresy, Docetism. If you believe that Christ was basically divine and only appeared to be human, which both of them have their attractions to modern people, and we don't say that so and so belongs to this or that heresy. We say they belong to the Westfield United Methodist Church, but that's what they really believe. And it's good to include that in sermons now and then, that the concepts that have prevailed in Christianity have prevailed for a reason. There's a delicate balance there within the Trinity between the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And it's often mislaid when the minister concentrates on social justice or on homosexuality or some single issue that becomes typical of the sermons.
Now, I got a broad brush question for you.
Okay.
And you only have 2 hours to do this one.
Okay.
Can you trace the history of how the Methodist denomination came out of the Church of England?
Well, that is a complicated story, and they always talk about John Wesley being the first Methodist, but Methodism during John Wesley's time, during his lifetime, was a part of the Church of England. Wesley never left the Church of England.
Really?
And he said, as long as I live, I will be a Church of England man. So that Methodism did not separate as such until 4 years after he died. The Methodist Church became a separate denomination. Now, the reason why it never actually separated during his lifetime was because he was smart enough. He was as smart as most of the bishops of the Church of England, so that if he wanted to do something like have the sacrament in his congregation, which might meet in a Huguenot church in London, an old, used, abandoned Huguenot church, and it would be in St. James Parish. Well, he should not technically perform the sacrament in St. James Parish without the permission of the rector or vicar of St. James. But instead of, he knew the answer would be no, you can't do it. So he went to the bishop instead, and he said, you know, we have a lot of members that are members in various churches. Well, they're all basically Church of England, but there are a few Quakers, and there are a few Baptists, and there are a few Presbyterians, and they don't go to the sacrament, which according to the doctrine of the church means that they're in trouble. So I will offer the sacrament to them. They're mostly in the outskirts of town. They'll come into this little chapel, an old Huguenot chapel on West Street. It's in St. James Parish. Now, it's not going to, we're not going to detract from what happens in St. James, but we're going to add this number of people. 1 week they'll come from this group. Another week they'll come from this group. Another week they'll come from this group, and they'll rotate. And in the end, you are saving more people for heaven or afterlife or whatever you want to say. You're going to be doing good for these people that wouldn't happen otherwise. Isn't that a great idea? And what can the bishop say? The bishop would say, yes, of course.
Do it.
And so when he would start doing that, the minister, St. James, the priest of the Church of England, would go to his bishop and say, hey, this John Wesley is preaching and administering the sacrament in my parish, and those are Methodists. They should be kicked out, and they should never be able to do that again. So can't you do that? And the bishop would say, well, I've already given my permission for him to do that. So that's an example of the kind of thing that Wesley would do to keep the Methodists as a part of the Church of England. They were really like a society within the Church of England.
Got it.
Like the Franciscans or the Dominicans in the Church of Rome. But he really said there's only two ways that we would separate. One is if we left, and we will never leave. And the other is if we're kicked out.
Mm-hmm.
If the bishops say, you're gone.
Mm-hmm.
And he was smart enough to keep in touch with all the bishops and keep the Methodists in place.
Now, I understood from my Methodist mother that Wesley established a series of chapels, particularly in the coastal areas of Britain. So if that is correct, then those would have been Church of England chapels. Am I reading you correctly?
Well, he did ask that the people, his people, go to the Church of England.
Okay.
But by that time, if your mother is talking about chapels, she's probably talking about Methodist chapels.
Right.
And they built them as, some of them were taken over from other buildings. Some of them, perhaps, Church of England. But generally speaking, they would be like around Manchester or Cheshire. I stayed overnight in a Church of England parish church, and actually I stayed in the rectory, but the minister said, you know, there are Methodist churches in this area, and he knew that I ran every morning, and he said, if you go on this route, you will pass 8 churches that are Methodists, chapels, he would call them, that are under one Methodist minister. He goes to as many as he can one Sunday. He goes to as many other ones as he can. He has a schedule that he follows. But all of those were either former Anglican chapels or primitive Methodist churches or other Methodist churches that had but separate denominations but combined in the 1930s. So that, like in this country, my younger brother went to Clymer as his first charge, the same as my father did. And that was in 67 or 68 when Methodism combined with the Evangelical United Brethren. And he went to North Clymer, and Clymer, 2-point charge. In North Clymer, there were 2 churches in town. One was a former Methodist, one was a former EUB. And now he had the problem of having 2 churches that were one now. The same as in England with those 8 churches in the same area. He had 2 churches, and he had to solve, you know, how do we unite these congregations? It's a problem.
It's a challenge. Now, can you go one step further and understand Methodism in the country was really established by Asbury? Is that
in
correct?
this country?
In the United States, yeah. Tell us a little bit about his work.
Okay, you should say Asbury and Coke, because they were together the first 2 bishops.
I stand corrected then.
That's all right. This isn't a class in Methodism, so you don't get a grade.
Okay.
But Coke was thoroughly British and never did well in this country. He traveled back and forth also, so that in the end, Coke is never remembered very much. There is a Coke Street in the first camp meeting of Chautauqua, but Coke Street is about where Clark Avenue is now.
Okay.
And the name Coke is gone because Coke fell out of favor with American Methodists. Asbury, however, stayed during the Revolution, took the side of the Americans during the Revolution, and even though he had to go in hiding because he was British, had to go in exile in Delaware. He stayed and continued after the Revolution to build the church, was a bishop in the church till he died in 1816, and really did a fantastic job. Asbury, known as the traveling bishop, you often see him on horseback.
Mm-hmm.
He's a model circuit rider.
Mm-hmm.
Went all over the place on horseback, but his main interest was keeping Methodists together, and also when the British separated off after the Revolution, what do you do with Methodism in this country? Well, you start a separate denomination.
Got it.
He called it the American Methodist Episcopal Church. Episcopal meaning there were bishops.
Right.
And he was a bishop. But interestingly enough, they had a meeting in North Carolina one time saying, we've either got to knuckle down and ordain each other because we don't have enough preachers to serve the people, or especially the sacrament, or we're going to have to do away with the sacrament because we have to have the sacrament.
Right.
And American Methodism started because Asbury was adamant about that, and the people were adamant, and so they got new preachers. He was ordained as a bishop, and he and Koch ordained others, and they ordained people to give the sacrament. So the Methodists had the sacrament.
That's terrific. Now, let's go a little step further. You've published extensively on Wesley. Where did you do your original work? What's the source of scholarship?
Well, it's also at Duke University.
Really?
Yes. I went there for divinity school.
Mm-hmm.
And the first year I was at the divinity school, I had a course with Frank Baker, who was British. And one weekend he had gone to England, or gone to Atlanta, Georgia. He was from England.
Mm-hmm.
Spoke with a British accent. And he came back, and on the first class meeting after the weekend, he told us about a diary that he had seen while he was in Atlanta at Candler. And this diary talked about his love affair with Sophie Hopke. And it was written in code and cipher. So a lot of the things were secret in there. His love affair with Sophie Hopke and the rules that he followed, and some of the reasoning behind why he in the end did not marry her. She married someone else, and how disheartened he was. And since all this is in code and cipher,
Mm-hmm.
well, I love mysteries.
Okay.
And I grew up playing games, that my mother taught us. And so this struck a chord with me. So when he suggested, I guess 2 years or a year later, had to come up with a dissertation, he suggested doing the Wesley diaries. And he said, as soon as he said diaries, I thought, detective work about Sophie Hopke, the love affair.
Mm-hmm.
And quite honestly, that's what got me into the topic of Wesley studies more than anything else.
And so you broke the code?
Yeah, I asked him, how should I do it? Because I knew it was in code, and I knew that he knew something about it. And he said, well, the best advice I can give you is start at the beginning. Here's a Xerox of Oxford Diary 1. Just start in the beginning. It changes every week, every month, and it will become clear to you.
Mm-hmm.
And sure enough, if you started, say, 3 or 4 months into it and ran across QXB, you'd have no idea what QXB was. But when you start at the beginning and it says capital QU, you know that's questions. And he's asking himself questions. X, he says capital EX. examination. That's self-examination.
Mm-hmm.
And B is BI. So he has 3 double-letter abbreviations that gradually work their way into QXB. And you know he's reading questions, he's having self-examination, and he reads the Bible. But who would know that if they didn't
So you
start early?
So you worked it through.
Everything is that way.
Mm-hmm.
When the ink changes and it says WD, what do?
Go back to the beginning and see if you can figure it.
It's always WD though. Well, you use the changing ink as a clue, and finally it hits you. That's when he wrote his diary. New pen, new ink, dip it in, and it's darker.
Got it. Now, if somebody wished to continue to do some work on Wesley, are there any specific places that are ideal for scholarship?
Well, as a historian, the nice thing about being a historian is there are always things to do.
Mm-hmm.
As time goes on, like right now, this is a moment in time
Mm-hmm.
which in just a minute will be historical.
Mm-hmm.
And has anybody ever written a history of your interviews? No. So that's one thing that a historian could do.
Mm-hmm.
You open that up into the area of the church or the history of the church. And so there are always new areas. The same with Wesley Studies. Wesley Studies is not a period of time in which something happened back 2 centuries ago.
Mm-hmm.
Wesley Studies is of no use unless it can be applied today.
Got it.
So the historian is always trying to get the facts straight. Historians, if you read the secondary studies that have been done, they've been done in a setting in which they've tried to put Wesley Studies in their setting, and they've read Wesley through their setting. So they're inaccurate because they're trying to make Wesley relevant to their time.
Got it.
And you try to do the same thing as accurately as you can, but as relevantly as you can.
Mm-hmm.
And one person, I read their biography of Wesley, and it was a bad biography. But the introduction had one important question that he answered. He said, "Has there been a study of Wesley written in the last 50 years?" He said, "No." He said, "I don't know much about the details, but I know that it's got to be rewritten for today."
Yeah. Wonderful point. Wonderful point. Now, you've done a lot of writing. Can you tell me about your new book?
The latest one that's published, or the
Right.
one I'm working on?
Both.
Okay. Well, the latest one that's published last year, or the year before, is on the portraits of Wesley.
Okay.
And I really got interested in that about 30 years ago. And so I've been collecting pictures of Wesley and looking at pictures of Wesley, and discovered that a lot of the places where they're found have mistakenly identified them.
Really?
Yes. So I decided, one, to publish a book, and this is just of pictures during Wesley's time, that were done during Wesley's time. Very few of them, and I would say I've got 120 illustrations in the book.
Really? Mm-hmm.
And they're almost all from this early period. And most of them were not painted from life. Some of them are caricatures. Some of them are just copies of a portrait that they liked, and they've changed it a bit to their liking.
Mm-hmm.
About a half a dozen are by good artists and done from life.
Right.
That are good paintings. So I've centered it upon those, but tried to be inclusive, showed the background of what went into painting, what went into printing, and most of the paintings that we see are in museums.
Really?
And most of the things that we see of John Wesley, portraying John Wesley, are prints.
Really?
And they're usually copies of another print, or, they're a copy of a copy.
Right. And
So it tries to figure out where they came from.
many of these were probably British then?
Yes, most all of them were
Okay.
British.
Let's drive this home a little bit. In colonial times, each of the colonies had a state church, as I understand it. What was the state church here in New York?
Well, there were different churches at different times. New York was first discovered basically around New York City by Henry Hudson and the Church of England. It's British people in
Right.
that area. Now, as you get farther west, it's Indian territory, American Indian, and Seneca's and Chautauqua is very difficult, for instance, to know where the name comes from and what it means. That's because it is an Indian name, and it comes from some Indian language that we don't know anymore. Now, during the Revolution, during the French and Indian War, there were French in this area of western New York. There were British up around Ethan Allen's territory in Lake George. And so there was no New York as we know it.
Really?
Yes. And it gradually forms as the Revolution and the colonies are transformed into a group of colonies and then a group of states. But Western New York has generally, from the earliest time on, been largely English with some German and some Dutch.
Okay.
And you could say there's a lot of mongrels around.
Got it.
Like I think there's French and German and Dutch and English and who knows what in my background.
Right. So it wasn't a matter then of dropping a formal affiliation in this area. They were just sort of polyglot with it.
Yes. There wasn't any strong affiliation especially in Western New York, until well into the 19th century, when this part of the country was the burned over district.
Got it.
And the Mormons come out of this area, the Free Methodists come out of this area, a lot of revival churches found this area conducive to their thinking.
Right.
So it's not like Pennsylvania, where Pennsylvania was settled by Penn
Right.
and Quaker,
Right.
and Roger Williams in Rhode Island, and the Puritans in New England. New York is sort of it's largely English, but it's not strongly as
Right.
some other areas.
I got a couple more questions. We're a little bit over for time. The
Okay.
crew always indulges me. Now, if some young Chautauquan came to you and expressed an interest in going into church work as a career, what would you counsel that student?
I'd say, well, what do you have fun doing?
That would be a question you would ask that person.
I would ask them. I would ask them the same things I ask anybody who is going into, say a ministerial student or an undergraduate or any of those. And I do a lot of counseling. But I say, if you have $250,000, how would you spend it? And I'd find out a lot about them, because what they're interested in, where they're spending their money, what they do in their spare time, that shows what they're really good at and what they're interested in. And that's where they should work, in that area. So if they don't say helping people, if they're not a people person, I try to work them away from the church, because to be involved in the church, a good person has to be a real person who is interested in helping others.
Got it.
And above all else. And if they're not, themselves a religious or spiritual person, that's another reason to steer them in another direction.
Right, right. I've got two easy questions here. Now, Duke is well known for its basketball team,
Right.
and you often go around campus, the grounds, wearing a hat that says Duke.
Right, it's in my car.
It's in your car. So I brought it in. Are you a fan of Duke athletics?
Yes.
What sports do you like best?
Well, while I was a student, I was a four-letter runner.
Really?
Yes. I earned athletic letters in track and cross-country and indoor track.
Okay.
So I've run in Madison Square Garden, in Penn Relays, all the big meets.
Right. Now, do you still go to any Duke events?
Yes. We had season tickets to basketball. We have season tickets to football. And I still officiate at track meets.
Goodness. So that's lots of fun, isn't it?
Yes.
And you're still running.
Yes. Still run. Ran in the Chautauqua old first night.
Old first night run.
Yeah.
That's terrific. Now, how about your kids? Are they athletes?
On the one side, they are. Jeffrey is the father of two of my grandsons who are both sportsters.
Mm-hmm.
One plays college basketball. The other is in high school and plays football, soccer, basketball, swimming, everything. On the other hand, John is a musician and is single, and the other one is a veterinarian. And her kids, both of them, husband and wife, are veterinarians, and so the daughter is a biologist, biochemist, and the son is an engineer. Neither one basically interested in athletics.
You've got the front cover here, don't you?
Yeah.
That's terrific. Sir, we are out of time. Do we have anything else we need to cover?
Do you have another hour and a half?
I'll come back and talk some more church history. This is terrific. Thank you so very much.
This has really been fun, by the way.
This has been fun to talk with people, and I'm glad you enjoyed it.